Hello everyone, welcome back to another Through the Bible study in which we will be summarizing book by book the entire Bible to give you guys an idea of the major events that occur within. Now, we won't be discussing everything that takes place in these books, which is why the purpose of these studies isn't to substitute personal Bible study, but inspire it. If you find events that you find significant and would like to dig more deeper into them, we'll be more than happy to provide exactly where and when this information took place. But to give you an idea of the book of Joshua, we are entering outside of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which were known as the books of Moses, and into the first book of the Bible that's titled after its author. Now, what's interesting about Joshua is not only his namesake, but the distinction between him and the books of Moses. Now, the first thing that we need to note is what they have in common, in that this, just like the Pentateuch, are all based on eyewitness history. Now, Deuteronomy also included prophecy, and Leviticus was largely legal briefs rather than a record of historical events. Of course, beyond the incident and why the sons of Aaron inherit their father's promise, but that's another story. If you don't know, listen to the study of Leviticus. It was interesting. But when we're talking about all these things, we're talking about events that took place in history and were written down by the people who were there. And if these events were ever exaggerated in any way, then they would have their contemporaries to call them out on it. And yet these events were preserved, and yet they give ample evidence and documentation as well as representation through monuments of all of these things. We can confirm this by archaeology. We can confirm this through history and the consistency of this message. But what's most important in understanding the book of Joshua is where Israel's at in their history, what kind of history is being recorded, because this is a lightning rod for many skeptics. When we're talking about Israel's transition from Genesis, the origins of the nation of Israel, to Exodus, their departure from Egypt and towards the Promised Land, Numbers, the reason why they didn't enter the Promised Land, rejecting God and going in every which way direction but the one God wanted them to go. And finally, 40 years later, beyond when they should have entered the Promised Land, are now about to enter, and we wonder why. Well, the book of Joshua records the conquest of Canaan, what is known as modern-day Israel, and this makes people wonder, okay, Israel's conquering land that other people have been living in for hundreds of years. Why? Well, in order to answer that, we need to understand exactly not just the who, referring to Joshua, the successor of Moses and leader of Israel, which was, by the way, selected by Moses, and more importantly by God, to do this exact task. The what, that it's eyewitness history. The when, and this is just for us nerds that care about these sort of things. This took place 1410 BC, all the way to 1403 BC. This is a 7-year period of time in which this book takes place. Where modern-day Israel, but the why of this book is what's most important. And if you understand this premise, you're going to be able to read this book as it was intended to be written, as the author wrote it. And that is because the Canaanites, the people living in this land, had been given 440 plus years of second chances, as they deliberately rebelled against God, a God they knew personally, a God they had direct witness to, a God who had shown them miracles to confirm not only his existence but authority. And in spite of these things, knowing better, that's the key, all the way back to the time of Abraham, now judgment was coming. God had presented before them, just like he had done with the nation of Israel, life and death, blessing and cursing, and he offers the mercy, the life, first. They rejected mercy. They rejected life. They rejected God. Therefore, all that's left is judgment. That's not what God wants to do, but after 440 years of doing things that I do not want to say, I will, but nonetheless, the things that they were doing were absolutely hideous, disgusting, even by moderns, probably not eventually going on in time as we continue to get more and more depraved, but nonetheless, to someone who still has a shred of morality left, these things even today would be considered disgusting. The 3 major idols that they were worshiping, it wasn't just like, oh, they set up some statues and were bowing down to it. Oh, God thought that they all needed to be wiped out for that. Do you know how the bowing down was actually taking place? Well, let's start with the main three. There were others. But the first and most primary god of the Canaanites that we know through archaeological evidence is Baal. Baal, which is the rain god of the Canaanites. And this was a god that was, he liked blood. He liked a lot of blood. In fact, he would like blood so much, he would demand of his followers they would mutilate themselves and pour it on them, on the floor, in order to dedicate themselves as offerings to Baal, in order to gain their attention. If you remember the prophets of Baal that battled with Elisha, that's how they were getting their God's attention. They would mutilate themselves to get their God's attention, as well as ritual intimacy with animals, the slaughter then of said animals, and the anointing of themselves and their families in that blood in order to gain the attention of their God, who loved this stuff. And for those of you who don't know, similar things are taking place in Mecca, which is based and centered around Baal worship, because the Nabatean god Allah is just a re-rendering of what that was all about. Kissing the black stone is also a pagan idea, running between the two hills. All the things that they do, they cut themselves in dedication and celebration of Muhammad and his sunnah. We're looking at all these things and seeing that nothing's changed in history, but that's quite frankly gross. But that wasn't the least of it. Ashtoreth worship was the second most popular, and much like we would see in modern-day sensibilities, the pornography industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the same was true in the ancient days. Ashtoreth worship didn't produce pornography per se, but presented the opportunity for your sexual desires to be indulged without any cultural resistance from your family. It basically required all children to make their rite of passage into puberty to make themselves, both boys and girls, homosexual, heterosexual, animals, family members, you name it. They would present themselves as prostitutes, and these people would ravage children in order to take care of their lusts and desires. That was Ashtoreth worship. Bestiality, rape, incest, all of these things that were happening in the nation of Canaan, and all of these things taking place, God put up with it for 400 years, but the last is the most appalling. Moloch worship was especially popular in Canaanite culture, and we can confirm this archaeologically because of the bones that we find engraved under the homes and through the altars that they built to this pagan deity. And of course, I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. Moloch was worshipped by human sacrifice, and human sacrifice that wasn't just enough to kill people in order to please this god. What you would do is, since they didn't have blenders and vacuums to shove the newborn infants into, they would bring the baby into this world, but because culturally, now no, we use science and say, well, it's a clump of cells, it's a fetus, it hasn't fully gained its dependency on this world yet. It's the same excuse, because in that culture they would say, well, we haven't named it yet, so it's not fulfilled its journey to become a full human being. And what they would do is they would take this child, who would remain unnamed intentionally, and they would present it to Moloch by dropping it on a brass oven that they would fill with coals and scream in order to drown out the baby's cries as it roasted alive. The god of self, the god of convenience, in order to achieve pleasure. Even if you wanted Moloch's blessing on your homes, you didn't even have to use the brass altar. You could place the newborn infant on the first brick of your home and smash it in order to dedicate your house to Moloch. God put up with this nonsense for 440 years, and even then was offering them mercy the entire time that all of these conquests were happening. And you wonder why God's people went to war. They weren't fighting them because they weren't Jewish. They weren't fighting them because they were just in the wrong place and Israel wanted that land. They were aware in Genesis chapter 15 exactly who would be held responsible to these things. And guess what as well? According to the Pentateuch, according to the Torah, as we went into explicit detail to discuss in Deuteronomy and Numbers, as well as in the book of Genesis, that these people were the ones who would be held accountable if they didn't stop doing these things and ultimately turned back to God. But what was also interesting about all these things is not only did they ignore these warnings, not only did they know better, but the people who weren't included in this mix wouldn't be held responsible for what they didn't know. God put up with this nonsense for 440 plus years, and you can look this up all in your own time. When Israel started doing the same thing, they were also kicked out of the promised land. The Canaanites were to be driven out. Military targets were to be wiped out. And in order for Israel to live at peace, those who had rejected every single last chance that God had given them to do so, they were the ones who would be held accountable. And that's why these wars were happening. Now, as we're going to be beginning this study, understand how this was actually recorded. Joshua saw these things happen. He took place in these battles, and he simply recorded the history as he saw it, as well as affirmed and confirmed by those around him. This is eyewitness history. This is dependable records. And when we're talking about something that is actually applicable to our day and age, it's worth paying attention to. There's a place for criticism, but once you have enough evidence, you have to come to a conclusion with it. And when we have been given this reason to not only trust the archaeological basis, which we'll discuss as we go through, but also the historical, also the personal and practical, and also the doctrinal, that this is in line with everything else we see in Scripture in some very significant ways, we're going to be seeing that this is, in fact, the first of many reasons why we can trust the Bible, because it presents itself consistently, accurately, and even prophetically. Israel is about to enter the Promised Land, and they are preparing to do so. And much like 40 years prior, Joshua decided to send in some spies. However, instead of sending 12, one from every single tribe, him and another man from the tribe of Judah, Caleb was from the tribe of Judah, and I believe Joshua is from the tribe of Ephraim. You can quote me on that and then issue corrections if I am worthy of that, being called on that. But nonetheless, those two were from the two tribes that trusted God and said, man, look, all these blessings God has in store for us, let's go. But the other 10 people that were sent into the land were too busy looking at the opposition and saying, God can't break that, God can't beat them, which in reality was, I can't break that, I can't beat them. But then they attributed that weakness to God. It showed they didn't trust him. So if you were going to look just skimming online and found a Yelp review for a restaurant that was 2 stars out of 12, what was the majority view of the nation? Well, they tried to murder Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. God intervened in the same way he did at the Red Sea crossing with Pharaoh, and that's why they were wandering the desert for 40 years. Caleb learned his lesson and said, instead of 12, we'll just send 2. So he sends 2. He wasn't one of them. But to go and make sure that they knew where they were headed next. And the first place they obviously stopped was immediately crossing the Jordan River, going to the city of Jericho, which was a military bastion and a very, very significant one at that. So much so that even homes were built into the city's walls. And they were staying in the house of a certain woman who was more likely than not just had gotten used to the Ashtoreth worship in her culture and decided to stay a prostitute. Her name was Rahab, and in the chapter of Joshua, which I encourage you to read on your own time, she specifies to these spies, the entire nation knows not only what's coming to them, but that they deserve it, and they are scared out of their wits. And Rahab, fancy this, takes the time to ask, look, I know your God's real. We heard about what he did against Og and Sihon. We heard about what you guys did at the Red Sea crossing. We heard about the plagues in Egypt. We know that your God is real. We remember the prophecies given to our ancestors. We know that you're here to judge us. Just like God used water at Noah's flood, just like God used fire at Sodom and Gomorrah, now he's using people, and we deserve it. Can you spare my family's lives? Now, this is interesting. Because not only did the spies say, well, since you hid us in your home, you told the guys, we heard that there's some Israelites in your city. Bring them out. We have to make a public example so Israel doesn't come in and get us. And Rahab's like, oh yeah, they were here, but they took off somewhere. So they locked down the city. They're hunting down the Israelites. And Rahab comes to the guys and says, can you just spare me and my family's lives? I spared your guys' lives, right? Well, here's the thing. It wasn't making matters even that ultimately caused them to come to this decision. The spies of Israel accepted her offer, but understand that God was in support of this idea as well. They told her, much like a certain other event in Israel's history, to put a red cord outside of her window, and that way they would know not to enter that city. Now, if you recall, that's very similar to the Passover. They would put the blood of the spotless lamb on their doors so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. The judgment of God. Egypt had rejected God's mercy 10 times, and now judgment was coming. Life was being taken. And in order to be given mercy, they obeyed God's command, which was an obvious parallel to the person of Jesus Christ and what he would ultimately do to cause God's judgment to pass over us as well. But when Rahab put that red cord out the window, what was she saying? The exact same thing. God's judgment was coming, and the Israelites wouldn't enter their home. But you know what was also interesting about Rahab? This is short term. Her life was spared. But long term, if you look in the genealogy of Matthew, you would notice that the, for all intents and purposes, great-grandma of King David, who was the progenitor of Jesus' physical family line, Mary and Joseph both bore direct lineage to David, just through different sons of his. Mary, of course, biologically was related to Solomon, and then Joseph, of course, likewise. But we're looking at all these things and saying, wait a minute, who was the woman who married the grandfather of Boaz, who's the grandfather of Salmon? Who was Rahab. So let me get this straight. 440 plus years of all of this disgusting idolatry. 440 years of this nonsense, rejecting God's mercy, and literally when God is drawing his gun for the firing squad, the trial's been given, they are just about to receive their sentence. She asked for mercy. And God's like, thank you for giving me the excuse. And puts the rifle away and says, I'm going to adopt you into my family. I'm going to use you to biologically bring my son into this world. I'm going to enter creation through your family line. Oh my goodness. We're talking about a God who doesn't want to punish here, aren't we? Ezekiel 33:11, 2 Peter 3, verses 7 through 10. The God of the Bible does not change. He will punish evil because he is perfect, but he wants to give mercy. And he's looking for any excuse. And how did Rahab do so? By acknowledging who God was and asking for mercy on his terms. How else do we come to Jesus again? So, that happens. The spies come back and say, yeah, God's got the place all set up for us. They're scared out of their wits. Well, they're about to enter Israel. Problem is they have a very interesting geographical feature that stands in their way. Remember, the nation of Israel isn't just composed of soldiers. It's composed of women, children, livestock, tents, important artifacts in the tabernacle. Everything that they would need, the needs of 3 to 5 million people would have to cross a river. And since we were also told that chronologically throughout the year, it's the time of the flax season in which they were laying those out to be netting for their homes, it was flood season. And for those of you who have seen recently, at the time of this recording, the hurricanes that have taken place for Irma and for Harvey and for Marie, floods anywhere from 3 to 4 feet deep can topple cars, can end lives, can destroy homes. And we're talking about the Jordan River, which at its deepest points would oftentimes reach to 35 feet deep in flood season. And at full rushing speed as well, oh my, they've got a problem. But here's what was interesting about all of this. God says, don't worry about it. Here's what I want you guys to do. Because you guys are going into battle and would be requiring you to trust me with your lives, I'm going to give you proof to trust me, just like I did to your parents. It's like, well, the Red Sea's pretty far away. So are you going to make the Jordan River part? He says, uh-huh. And here's how we're going to do it. Now, pay attention here because this is fun. You'd have the Ark of the Covenant leading the people of Israel. So you'd have all the priests carrying it on the poles, not touching it, but ultimately it being the representation, the manifestation of God's presence, right? Now, as God would be leading the nation of Israel, Joshua would be following shortly behind the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is where we actually get into terms in the Hebrew here, because Joshua is the English rendition of Yeshua, or Yahoshua would be the complete way of pronouncing it. If we were to apply this in the Greek language, it would be Jesus. Spanish, it would be Jesus, Joshua, Yeshua. This was his name, the same name of the Messiah. So he would be leading the way for the nation of Israel to cross, the direct manifestation of God. And you know what was also interesting? Is you knew who would be with Joshua? One representative from all the tribes of Israel. How many tribes of Israel were there again? 12. So, Jesus and 12 followers. This is too fun. Anyway, and then as they were leading the rest of the nation, they would be about a mile behind them. So they wouldn't be able to see everything that they did, but they'd know the direction that they were headed. So like say if Joshua saw a sharp rock and you had to step over it, the nation wouldn't see that. They would have to know when they got there. But they would ultimately know, we're heading towards the Jordan River, that's the direction we need to go. So at a distance, the rest of the nation would follow them. And their 12 disciples. But anyway, so the 12 disciples, Jesus, you see God and everything else. This really interesting thing. But God tells the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and he says, go to the center of the Jordan River and stand there. I'm going to block it on one end. The water's going to stand in a heap because the river's just going this way. It's not an ocean, it's a river. So God will just stop it like a dam, and they will be able to walk on dry land, just like they did at the Red Sea. Now note, all these kids were the ones who were born during the wilderness wanderings. So they didn't see this miracle. They would be getting their own. And the priests are still like, yeah, but that's a very deep river, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to stand up. I'm trusting you, God, okay. And so they're just planning to go to the middle of the Jordan River before anything helps in this. You know, they'll be underwater. They'll need like big old reed snorkels and stuff to be able to survive. Well, the funny thing was they only had to take one step in the Jordan River's water, and God forced it all back so that they could all make it across safely. So God doesn't need much to do a miracle. He just wants you to trust him. All this stuff was taking place. The ark stood in the middle of the Jordan River, or rather the crater that now is the Jordan River. And all 3 to 5 million people passed, and then before the Ark of the Covenant left, God told Joshua and the 12 people that were following him, I want you to make a memorial so that people actually have tangible evidence to remember that this event took place in history, that they would have reason to trust me. You could put this in its own museum if you wanted to, but what I want you to do is this. You're going to go to the deepest part of the river and grab a big, big rock. All 12 of you are each going to grab a rock, something that wouldn't have been able to have been carried out if you went to the deepest part of a river and were just like, just trying to pull a fast one or something. You would have to be going on dry land. You would have to have help. And they would stack up these 12 stones. Now, as you know, river stones, something that's constantly having water erode away, they're very smooth. And these very smooth rocks would stand at a sharp contrast to all the jagged and naturally formed rocks that were around them. So when a kid would walk by and say, one of these things does not belong, one of these things is not like the others, Dad, what are those smooth rocks, that giant pile there? What's that for? And he says, that's where our ancestors crossed the Jordan River. And then he'll take him closer and point him to a big mound sticking out of the water as well and say, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant stood. Because the people of Israel were also told, take 12 rocks from the dry land and stack that up so that you can see exactly where this took place. God provided evidence. Now, these memorials were the first of many, but now they had entered into the promised land. What were they there to do again? They were going to battle. So time for combat. How are we going to do this? Jericho, those of you who've seen VeggieTales, you know how this all went down, but I'll summarize it for the sake of those listening. Israel came across its first military bastion. They weren't soldiers, they weren't well equipped, they had been born and raised walking in the desert. And all their needs provided for them, no high protein diets. The average height of an Israelite was 5'4" to 5 even. The Canaanites biologically have more in common with me. I'm 6'3". So you got an army of 5 foot even guys, 6'3" guys, and I'm scared of them. It would probably be because they got a giant guy behind him. They got God on their side. So they are hiding. They're bunkered down, and Joshua's like, okay, so do we start like cutting down trees, building battering rams? Do we siege the city? I guess they're already doing that for us, but what do we do here, God? God says, just gather the nation, don't say anything, just walk around the city and come home. Like to build a trench? Are we going to dig under? No, just walk around it, come home. Okay, so the people of Jericho are like, oh no, here they come. It's just... What gives? And then they came back the next day. Oh no, they were just messing with us. What's going to... And they did this once around Samba 6 days in a row. Now you could imagine the people of Jericho were feeling three things. They were scared already, but now they were nervous and confused. The people of Israel were definitely the last of which, but this was just what God told them to do. So they walk around the city. Then on the seventh day, what did they do? They were told to walk around 7 times. Get their ram's horns out. Now, no, ram's horns aren't very demonstrative instruments. You can look up online what they sound like. It's just a little brrr. There was nothing natural that could have caused what was taking place. They didn't wear down the walls. Houses were built into this thing, okay? They were just told, after 7 times, yell. Sound your ram horns. The walls are going to fall outward, and you're going to be able to go up on these ramps and take the city. The walls fell, except for one part. 50 guesses whose house that was. Time's up, Rahab. But they go into the city, and obviously the Canaanites have the bejesus scared out of them because the walls just collapsed because they walked around it and yelled. It's just like, oh my gosh. Or more literally, oh your God, right? So all these things are happening, and they are just freaking out. The entire city is routed and driven out of the promised land. First victory, God. Now, I emphasize that point as not to be Israel, because God did everything in that battle. They just kind of cleaned up what was already routed. Now, here's what's interesting about this as well. God said, this is my victory. Everything that you take as far as treasure from the city, everything that the people of Jericho left behind, that goes to the tabernacle. That goes to me. This was my battle, my victory. Now note, it's also important to note that at the next battle at Ai, when they took that city, what did God say? It is all yours. What did they say when they won the battles in the north and south? It is all yours. God just wanted them to trust him with the first. Unfortunately, when they were told to bring all this treasure into the priesthood, in the entire nation, one person didn't listen. His name was Achan. Achan, by the way, his name literally meant annoying, so you could imagine what his parents felt about him. But he saw a Babylonian robe, some gold, and some silver coins, and he just had to have it. Now note, he wouldn't be able to wear it, he wouldn't be able to spend the gold, just like treasury of Canaan. It's like, where'd you get that? I found it under a rock. It was loose wallet or something. Now, he wouldn't be able to enjoy any of this. He just had it for its sake. Now, it would be at this time that Joshua should have prayed to God and said, what are we doing next? He would say, we've got some domestic issues before we start invading other territories. But Joshua forgot to pray. He forgot to ask God. And note, first of many examples, not the first actually, but many examples. This is why we can trust this as a historical document, an account of embarrassment, something that you wouldn't make up to make yourself look bad. If you're going to make up a story, you were the one who always did what was right. If you admit to something that makes you out to be the moron, then it means you were just being honest about an event that took place. You can imagine that Joshua is hesitant in admitting this as well, but we see this in the Gospels. We see this in every single account in the Bible. It tells the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's history. But when we're talking about what was going to take place, Ai didn't have massive walls. It just had massive people. And they're like, well, we beat, first mistake, God beat. But they said, we beat the people of Jericho easy. Oh, we don't need the whole army for Ai. Just send a small force. We'll rout them. Well, Joshua said, all right. So he sent the force. The people of Ai were freaked out about Jericho, and they fought like wild, rabid animals, right? And over a dozen people ended up getting killed, and Israel was running for their lives back to the camp. Now, not only are the people of Ai laughing, but now the whole nation of Canaan knows these people aren't invincible. Maybe they just got lucky at Jericho or something. They weren't there to see it. Maybe their God isn't real. And now Joshua goes to God, finally, and starts praying, God, what's going on here? Now the whole nation of Canaan is going to come after us. We're all going to die. God, why'd you bring us out here in the first place? It was just going to lead to this. And God said to Joshua, get up. There's sin in the camp. You need to deal with this. And Joshua's like, who? I'm not going to judge him until he's had an opportunity to come forward. Mercy first. So they gathered the whole nation of Israel together, and they said, someone stole from God's treasury. We specified to all of you that everything in Jericho belonged to the tabernacle. You were stealing from God. If anyone knows anything, if you did it, come forward. You won't be punished. Chirp, chirp, chirp. No response. He's from the tribe of Judah. You can imagine that's when Achan's eyes kind of got bulgy. But nonetheless, you've now borne false witness. You had the opportunity to come forward. You'll be required to repay what you stole plus 4 to God. Chirp, chirp, chirp. He's from this specific family. Now, you are blaspheming the name of God. Come forward now, and only you will be punished. Your family won't have any participation. And in fact, the family members should probably know this guy. Bring him forward now. Only he will be punished. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It's Achan. God revealed this, and he gave him not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 chances to come forward with all of this. And the first time there wouldn't have even been any punishment. But the more he delayed and denied God's ability to forgive him, the more he realized he was just fulfilling his own prophecy. Joshua just comes up to him and says, dude, what the heck? And he comes clean with it then, but by then it's already too late. And I mean, I'm a guy, so I find this stuff funny, but it says when they stoned Achan, they built a mountain on top of him. It just must have been a lot of rocks. But nonetheless, now Achan had been dealt with. Then they moved on to Ai. Now, it's actually pretty neat how they took the city, too. What they did was they took advantage of Ai's first victory. They said, okay, so here's what you're going to do. Joshua, you lead a small force. Think that you only have 1 trick in your money belt, right? So you're going to go and attack the city, and then when the people of Ai start fighting back just at all, you'll just say, oh no, we forgot, you guys are tough, and then run for their lives. Well, the people of Ai are like, well, we've seen this before. Well, who cares if they're a whole camp? These guys are a bunch of pansies. Let's wipe them out. And they completely abandoned the city, everybody. And they started chasing after the people of Israel. And meanwhile, they realized this was only a small force. The other 100,000 would be in hiding and would go into the city after it had been completely evacuated. And they burned it to the ground. Now remember, the people of Ai are out there chasing the people that Joshua is leading, but then they realize a huge army has just burned all their homes to the ground. So they turn around and they're like, oh no. And then Joshua, who was formerly running away from them, turns around, oh no. And Joshua went, oh yes. Well, they won the battle. So that's how that went down. Now, Jericho, toast. Ai, literally, toast. The third enemy on their horizon were the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were one of those specifically named, who were participating in these things, who knew better, who ultimately were to be held accountable and had deserved God's judgment, and they were next on the list. So they look at each other and they're like, Jericho was bigger than us. The AI people were stronger than us. We're dead. We got to figure out a way to have these people just make a treaty with us. And he's like, well, no, probably their God told them that this is kind of a discipline. There's no treaties with terrorists at this point. I know. What if we convince them that we're not actually on their list? And so they sent these ambassadors out, and they said, like, okay, make yourself look all, messy, mess up your hair, just get, like, disheveled clothes, deliberately pack all of these moldy food. Like, why would you bring that a long journey? And just, like, pretend that you'd been out this for weeks, It's just like, whew. Oh, man, it was quite a journey. Oh, hey, Israel, how are you? Hey, we're from this place, like, really, really far away. Probably never heard of it. But we heard about what your God's doing and what you guys have done. And we want to support you, alliance and all that kind of stuff. You protect us and we protect you in case any of us are in a bind. And Joshua's squinting and he's like, okay, I don't see anything wrong with that. We're supposed to live in this land at peace, so I don't mind. But how do we know that you're not just pulling a fast one on us? And he's like, oh, you need proof? Here, look. These were hot and ready when we left our land, but now look, they're all moldy. I mean, why would we just pack these? I mean, look at my shoes, look at my clothes. You think I just dressed like this morning? They did. But Joshua's just like, I'm convinced. Now, once again, did he pray? Did he ask God? No. Once again, another account of embarrassment. 2 strikes against Joshua, but also 2 in favor for this being a reliable historical record. And then the Gibeonites are like, great, so we have this signed, stamp, good, so, and then they head off. And then Israel gets ready to go to their next conquest, and they come to the land of the Gibeonites. And the ambassadors come out and say, hey, we got a treaty. Don't. They tricked us, right? But you know what was interesting? God said, no, in our day and age, any contract that is predicated on fraud is not binding. If you lie to get a deal done, you don't have to keep the deal. But God said, I'll take that as an ask for mercy. And guess what? The Gibeonites were all spared. The Gibeonites were allowed to live in the promised land. And God said, you're going to be given the special honor of getting to serve and help my Levites, the priests. You're going to get the opportunity to daily be exposed to the worship of the true and living God and get the chance to learn exactly about what you've been rejecting all these years. So, once again, priority of mercy. But here's also the problem. How's the rest of the nation going to look at them? Well, pretty much the same way that the traitor guy in Star Wars Episode 7 is just be like, hey, what gives, man? You were one of our great military cities, Jericho, AI. Now the Gibeonites surrendered. We gotta do something about this. So all the tribes in the north, all the people groups that were in rebellion against God and knew they were next on that list because of the prophecy given to Abraham, that they had access to, by the way, they said, look, we can't take Israel, but the Gibeonites double-crossed us. Why don't we just take them out? And that way Israel's going to be cut off. They're going to probably be intimidated. They may run off. Who knows? Maybe even we can take some of them down. If we're going to go down, we're going to go down like men. We're going to go down swinging. So they gathered together this giant Lord of the Rings style army. And instead of attacking Israel, because they understood that was probably a bad idea, they attacked the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites are like, hey, Minas Tirith flag here. We need King Theoden. We need the horses. Help! And Israel, Joshua learned this time. Israel looks at Joshua. Joshua looks at the Lord and says, what are we going to do? And God says, just rush them. I got this. Now this is really cool. Joshua gathers up Israel's army and they just rush the military, just mass, hundreds of thousands of guys, chariots of iron, all these different things. Best military technology available. And they're just like, God's people are here. We got to run. Now, here's the thing. They can run all they want. Might catch up to some, might not with others. But what's going to happen to Israel if around every corner and hiding under every single, basically, bush, that they would have people waiting, swords drawn and a vendetta, is saying, like, we're going to make sure that you can't take 2 steps without a terrorist attack. You're going to be reporting one in the news every single day. We're going to turn this into a long-term guerrilla-style warfare. We're going to make sure that you have to pay for every single inch of this land in blood. Well, Joshua's like, no, we're not playing that game. You guys can all run, but our God can make sure that you guys aren't going to be able to hide. So here's what happened. Reliable record so far? Well, here's what took place. All these northern armies had gathered together. They're not all running. Now, what's going to happen as they keep running and running and running? Well, the sun's going to start going down. And at night, it's much harder to find people than during the day. So here's what Joshua did. He got up on top of a hill and said, "Sun, stand still in the sky." And it did. Now, obviously, it wasn't Joshua's influence that did this. God already had the idea. Joshua was just praying according to what God already wanted to do. And he said, hey, I was thinking the same thing. Now, this is where your little astrologer brains are probably turning. And you're just like, wait, but the sun doesn't orbit around us. We orbit around the sun. God didn't stop the sun. He would have had to have stopped us. So how would this have worked? Did God just slam the brakes on the Earth's orbit? Since we're moving at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, wouldn't that mean that we would all just go flying? I mean, what happens if you're in a car and you just slam on the brakes going 60? Your body is still going 60, so you go through the windshield, right? Well, there's 2 ways to stop a car. You can either do it immediately or gradually. And for the sake of scientists who actually don't assume right off the bat that the Bible is false, they're willing to actually look into how this would have taken place. And guess what? If God's the one who set this Earth's orbit in motion, and who's the one who keeps this Earth's orbit in motion, how hard would it be for him, 1,000 miles at the equator, to slow it down and yet still keep the tides in place, still keep our weather systems in place, still keep the current, still keep everything functioning how it should for a temporary pause? Not hard at all. If you believe Genesis 1:1, then Joshua chapter 8 isn't hard at all. But here's the interesting thing. Don't quote me on that. I think it's 11 actually. I'll double check that in a moment. But nonetheless, it would only take, according to the scientists who actually looked into the science behind this, if the Earth's orbit was to be halted, it would have taken 15 minutes for the Earth to have been reduced from 1,000 miles an hour to 0 and not have anyone notice. It was Joshua chapter 10. So we're looking at all these things taking place and we're realizing, okay, so not that difficult, but do we have any other examples of all these things taking place? If Israel had a long day, right, an extra extended day, well, what would have happened in, say, on the other side of the world, North America, where they would have had a long night? What about in China, where they had a long afternoon? What about in Australia, where they'd be just, flushing their toilet and it goes around the other direction and stuff? What would it be like there? Well, we look at all these things. We look at the Indian, the Chinese, we look at the Norse, we look at all these African and just intercontinental legends. And we realize that around this time in history, there was a development in their mythology, where we have stories of, say, for the Egyptians, for instance, where the moon serpent Apophis was able to halt Ra's chariot for a short period of time. And by the way, Ra's chariot was what they believed was the sun as it arced in the sky. And Ra was able to fight him back and then continue going after a short time. We hear in China, we hear in Northern Europe, why they have these festivals of people lighting all these bonfires. It's like the sun stopped, it's weakening, it stopped. We have to help it get all this heat up into the air. All these common factors, Indian legends, Norse legends, Chinese, all these other different things. And they all, at this point in history, would have a note in common that something happened to the sun. So, nonetheless, we have the evidence. What you choose to do with it is ultimately what separates the men from the boys, the skeptics from the person who's willing to come to a conclusion. But then it gets really, really funny. Again, speaking as a guy, because I like war and all that nonsense. Then God does something else, as if stopping this, making the Earth's orbit halt for a short time. That is significant enough. But then God said, well, what if you can't keep up with the Gibeonites? Or not the Gibeonites, the Canaanites. How are you going to win this fight? I know. I'll contribute. And so God sent a meteor shower that only hit the Canaanites. Now, for those of you who know, just imagine, like, remember Will Ferrell's movie Elf, where he was throwing the snowballs and he just wouldn't miss? Do you think that God, when he's doing these rounds, do you think that when he was chucking these rocks, that any of them missed? Now, I just have this mental image of how this went down. Just the Israelites like, oh my gosh, a meteor. It's just mowing down Canaanites, just hitting them in the perfect spots in their armor and stuff. And the people of Israel are like, hey, cool. So God won that fight. That was funny. And now all of these northern cities are now empty of their military reserves. So you know what Israel does? They go to the ones that were still a military threat and they burn them to the ground. But what about the others? They leave them alone. Oh, no, don't believe this guy. He's just reading the plain text. What about National Geographic, where it says because they were all racists and just taking over this land for the sake of military conquest? For crying out loud, just read history. The kings of the south saw the same thing. There weren't as many, but they tried the same move. The same thing happened, aside from the sun standing still because it was a smaller army. The meteorite shower took care of them too. But now the book concludes, and note this was a very long stretch of scripture. Chapters 12 all the way through the end of the book were essentially just overviewing what had already happened and how the land was divided up by territories. And the specific regions were given to each tribe, but each tribe would decide whose farmland would go to whose family according to just casting lots. They would just agree based on that basis. And they were to set up barriers that would mark these territories so that if you ever sold land, you would ultimately get it back at the year of Jubilee. And all of these different things were to be enforced in Israel as sacred property, saying this is God's land and I've given it to you. If you steal from each other, you're stealing from me. The cities of refuge were set up on the western side of the Jordan River, and ultimately these would be where Israel would all have access to a fair trial and the opportunity in case a crime took place and they were innocent or they were falsely accused of a crime that was capital. They would go to these cities and have the opportunity for a legal system to be put in place, and ultimately Israel was to be a theocracy, that God would be their king. And his involvement was a lot more direct than all these other nations, but ultimately this was what set the foundations for the nation of Israel. Now note, Jerusalem still wasn't conquered. That would be done by David 400 years from now. The majority of the land, the Philistines, the Amalekites, all these other individuals, they were still in the land, and some of the people that they actually spared they shouldn't have, and ultimately ended up being a hazard to them in the future. We'll discuss this when we get to the book of Judges. But among all of these things, understand, despite all of these miracles, despite all of these victories, Israel started to pick up the idols and say, he started practicing it, but behind closed doors, under the cover, so to speak. Joshua knew this. You could see it. And at the end of his life, after him and Caleb were given first dibs on where their family was going to live because they trusted God, God says, you can have whatever land you want. He's just like, I want those mountains. And Joshua's like, I like that nice beachside view. But Joshua just takes a look at all the nation and says, look, you guys have all seen what God has done. He hasn't led us astray thus far. The only times we ever got in trouble is when he rejected them, or when we rejected him. So ultimately, what you choose to do, you will be held accountable for. But famous quote, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You can either enjoy this land by enjoying him, or you can reject him and by it lose this land. Your choice. That's the book of Joshua. If you guys have any sincere questions or would like to know more details about this stuff, perhaps articles from the scientists that would confirm these things, more than happy to share them. But if you guys really want to see this ministry grow, want to see the reason why these videos have been put forward, share it with people who otherwise wouldn't open the book and perhaps would benefit from just having the opportunity to hear it summarized and create that hunger and thirst for righteousness, for his name's sake. If you guys want to encourage the ministry, do so. Most importantly, if you're sharing this study, if you're listening to this study, please, I'm more than happy to accept questions. Remember why these studies are being put forward, to not only know in history what God has done and why we can trust it, but also what's even more important is that God's priority is always mercy. If it wasn't clear with Rahab and it wasn't clear with Gibeon, let it first and foremost be guaranteed on the basis of Jesus Christ.